not unmuted though. Where's my? Oh, yeah, perfect.
Well, good morning. I apologize for the slight delay, but it's just the still dealing with technology and the world that we have been living in for the last few months. I'm very pleased to be here with Councillor Gary Crawford. I don't think people have a full comprehension given how the system works, and a lot of it happens sort of behind the scenes as you do months and months and months of work preparing, starting now in the ordinary course for next year's budget. But this year we've had the added layer of this year's budget not going along kind of in the normal course and speed. And Councillor Gary Crawford, the budget chief, has spent an immense amount of time, and I want to thank him publicly for that. He works, of course, with our very capable city staff, the city manager, Chris Murray, and the chief financial officer, Heather Taylor, in doing all this work to cope both with the expected, which is a budget process that has sort of begun in its very earliest of stages for next year, but more particularly in dealing with some very significant current challenges that we face as a result of the pandemic. Today, as you know, the Executive Committee agenda was released with a report on the 2020 operating budget variance. This is a report that would come in the normal course to keep the public and the Executive Committee and the City Council informed as to the state of the city's finances any year, but in particular, of course, it's very important this year. The report provides a substantial update on the actual impact to date, as it turns out, of the COVID-19 pandemic on our city's finances, and contains projections through to the end of the year. As we pointed out many times, the city has incurred millions of dollars, tens of millions of dollars in costs responding to COVID-19. And this is not a complaint. This is a statement of fact, and in fact, it's a statement proudly made, because a lot of that money has been invested in making sure that our most vulnerable communities have been properly cared for during the pandemic. It has saved lives, and I think it allowed Torontonians to be protected during a very acute health crisis. We've also, during the same time, lost hundreds of millions of dollars in revenue, especially when it comes to our transit service, which we maintained for those who were still having to travel to work, and many of them were people we relied upon to go to work to look after us. But this was within the context of overall dramatically reduced TTC ridership, which of course cost the transit system hundreds of millions of dollars so far, with more to come. The report from the Chief Financial Officer states that the city is projecting a $1.9 billion COVID-19-related shortfall by year-end, and that is consistent with most of the projections we've been making public during the last period of time. Now, this will partially be offset, and this is very important to note, by mitigation measures that have been undertaken, and I thank our city staff for all of their hard work on this, because they've done this. We sat down and talked about the fact that we had to go and do our share, and so far there are $514 million in cost savings that we've identified at this time, as well as there has been some underspending in some areas. But this would still create for the city a net deficit after the savings that we've brought about of $1.35 billion, which represents 11.6% of the 2020 operating budget. And I think anyone who's managed a small or a large budget would know that if you're 11% off, this is very difficult to make up, and it becomes even more difficult to make up as you start into that process halfway through the year. We've done the $500 million, but the savings now are more difficult to come by without cutting services, which we'll get to in a moment. These projections are our best estimates. They assume that our current path of recovery and restart continues, but our financial shortfall could be even bigger if we end up being hit, which we all hope we're not, by a second wave. Now, people ask the question, what is driving that overall $1.9 billion financial impact? Well, first and foremost, lost revenue at the TTC. Ridership losses peaked at 86% below budget in the month of April, in late April, and are currently projected to be 80% below budget through the summer. Now, this was partially offset by the implementation of cost containment strategies and matching service capacity to demand. So there has been some adjustments made to the service, and unfortunately that has also involved some TTC employees being laid off. Lost revenue for the municipal land transfer tax, and that is projected to be at $249.2 million by the end of the year. Increased cost in shelter support and housing administration, a lot of this to do with looking after some of those most vulnerable of our fellow residents that I referred to earlier. And those additional costs are projected to be $185.2 million by year end. And this includes, for example, I think as many of you will know, the leasing of 17 hotels and the use of 7 community centres to ensure that the new physical distancing requirements could be complied with for our homeless population as well, to provide for the care of some of our most vulnerable residents. Increased costs in senior services and long-term care, additional costs of $6.2 million to date, and projected additional costs for the year of $17.6 million. And this, again, reflective of the additional costs of prevention and containment measures in place for COVID-19. And finally, just to cite some of the larger items, lost revenue in court services, $9.4 million to date, projected to be $14.7 million by year end. And this is largely due to lower than planned ticket issuance and partial suspension of collection activities due to COVID-19. So we have been clear. We believe it would be the wrong approach to take, that we should not and must not cut services which would fall disproportionately on our most vulnerable citizens in order to make up for this shortfall, which was no fault of the city government. It was not any behaviour or management practice of the city government that led to this shortfall. It was a pandemic. It was COVID-19. And we've also been equally clear in saying that a huge tax increase is not something that would be an appropriate measure at this time. The report notes that to generate $1.9 billion in revenue, a 60% residential property tax increase would be required. And I think it is obvious from the struggles people are having already, young and old, this would not be a proper solution to this problem. It would hurt everyone that we have worked so hard as governments together to help during this crisis. We are working to save wherever we can. We've reached $514 million in things that we found, and we haven't given up yet. By no means have we concluded the search for savings and efficiencies we can bring about without hurting people. The report notes that the city has implemented a series of spending and workforce restraints, which have generated $188.4 million in savings to date, and are expected to generate that total of $514 million by the end of the year. And these spending restraints include, as I pointed out earlier, matching transit service to demand, which regrettably has led to some layoffs, reducing discretionary spending, reviewing all services and prioritizing critical, essential, and priority services, and tracking and forecasting COVID-19 related savings. There are some things we just haven't been able to do as a government which have led to some savings. Workforce restraints include redeployment of staff to critical and essential service areas, implementing emergency and seasonal part-time staff layoffs, and the implementation of a hiring slowdown. These workforce restraints have affected 9,980 staff members or potential staff members, including 1,008 full-time staff on unpaid leave, 475 part-time staff on unpaid leave, 5,100 spring recreation workers who were not hired, and 3,397 additional rec workers who were not hired due to programming reductions caused by COVID-19. The Executive Committee will consider this report at its meeting on July 20th, and Council will then in turn consider the report on July 28th. As I mentioned earlier, this is a report that would come in the ordinary course each year to the Council, as it does come to us on a regular basis through every year. At City Council, though, we will have an additional report in preparation now by the City Manager and the Chief Financial Officer on what I can only describe as the grim strategies that we would have to undertake if help does not arrive from Ottawa and Queen's Park. Councillor Crawford and I have sat through countless meetings now trying to find ways in which we can come up with that kind of money that's left over after the $514 million in savings, and the only place you have to turn is either to a massive tax increase, which we find to be unacceptable to the people at this stage, or to damaging cuts to services that would have to be made. The mitigation options that will be contained in the City Manager's report to be presented to Council in September would be implemented, or would have to be considered for implementation by the Council in the event that adequate financial support did not come from the federal and provincial governments. At this stage, with this report that is in front of us today and in front of the Executive Committee and Council in the weeks to come, the Council is not being asked to make any particular decisions. These reports are intended to ensure that the Council, on an ongoing basis, has all of the information that it needs to make critical decisions about how we will balance the city's budget and what is required to do that if the federal government and the provincial governments do not come through with adequate help, as they have done, I should note, in many other sectors. And I'm grateful for the support they've provided to us and to many other sectors of the economy. But what they've provided to us so far is a very small portion of the problem that I've tried to outline this morning with Councillor Crawford, and that is why we've been counting on them to come to some agreement and to help us in a substantial way, and to help other cities and towns across Ontario and indeed across Canada. The city staff, I will say to the public, have done a fantastic job at both constraining spending and identifying these areas where we could save what now amounts to, so far, $514 million, so that we did not just sit back and say we need other people to give us money to sort out these problems. We took action right away and will continue to do so. We have made some progress in our conversations with the other governments. We have worked in a unified manner as a council, but also with the other mayors in the GTHA to make sure that people understood this was not just a Toronto problem. It is a problem affecting all mayors and heads of municipal councils across the province to a degree or another. Naturally, Toronto's problem is bigger because this is the biggest city in the country and the most complex in terms of its government by far, and complex in terms of some of the problems we face. We look after a lot of homeless people that I know for a fact are people that are people from the region, as opposed to people who are just residents of the City of Toronto. The GTHA mayors and chairs said yesterday that municipalities across the GTA are at the forefront of dealing with the COVID-19 pandemic and have been since the beginning. And it is also true to say that those very same municipalities will be at the forefront of an effective, strong recovery. And that's important not just to those municipalities, but it's important to Canada. The fact remains, though, that while cities continue to respond to the pandemic, they're experiencing unprecedented costs and very significant revenue losses. I've outlined some of the losses that face Toronto, and I'm sure other mayors and heads of council could outline the very substantial tens and tens of millions of dollars in the same costs and losses being experienced by other municipalities. These unprecedented financial circumstances require unprecedented action from the federal and provincial governments. We do remain hopeful that a federal-provincial funding agreement to support municipalities can be reached so as to avoid devastating cuts to frontline services or unaffordable property tax increases. The report today makes clear the stark reality we are facing and the measures we have taken to save whatever we can, with that work still continuing under the leadership of our City Manager, our Chief Financial Officer, Councillor Crawford, and myself. I emphasize the latter so that people will understand that when confronted with this financial disaster, I did not simply put my hand out to Ottawa and Queen's Park and say, please fix this for us, but rather we all got to work together under the leadership of myself and Councillor Crawford and the City Manager and the Chief Financial Officer to so far find $514 million in savings on our own, so that the problem we are seeking help with from the other governments would be minimized to the maximum extent that we could. And so I look forward to reviewing this report with my council colleagues and to emerging from that discussion united and strong as a council to indicate once again that we need support from the other governments. I indicated yesterday that I think that the way this is going to happen best is if there is a national strategy to address this, because this is a national problem faced by cities right across the country, the biggest problem being in the country's biggest city. And a national strategy can only be orchestrated in the end by the national government, working admittedly in partnership with the provinces, who have to sit at the table and be prepared to discuss these matters in good faith as well. But it has to be a national strategy led by the national government. We need to come together now as a council, speaking for ourselves, to put pressure on the national government and on the provincial government, though I should say that Premier Ford has been a very effective and consistent advocate for cities and for the City of Toronto in these matters. But we need them now to come forward with the money that is necessary so that we do not have to make further, much more drastic cuts than have already been made in the course of dealing with these financial issues. I'm now happy to take your questions.
Thanks, everybody. We will now open the floor to questions. It's one question, one follow-up. First up, we have Mark McAllister from City News. Go ahead, Mark.
Mayor, at one point in May, you had spelled out the possible cuts that the city would face if the province and the feds didn't come through. All were very significant when talking about TTC services, fire services, police, childcare, the shelter system, among others. Can you spell out, or have you found other things that may end up falling into that list since that time?
The city manager's report, to be prepared for the July meeting of City Council, will set out these strategies that we could adopt if we absolutely had to. We'd do it very regretfully, but we could. The list hasn't changed that much because all you have to look at is the city's budget and see that the biggest areas of expenditure are on things like public transit, like homelessness, like childcare, and to see that what we would have to do is lay off a whole lot of people because they're a big cost center for us, obviously, but that means an inability to deliver the level of service that people have come to expect from the city. So we're very optimistic that we can avoid that, but the city manager's report will be very candid and very straightforward in indicating where we would have to cut if we had to make up that remaining $1.35 billion. It will come out in due course. And we've been spending our time, Councillor Crawford, myself, the city manager, the CFO, trying to find other ways to make those reductions, but there really aren't any. I mean, the budget speaks for itself. This is what the budget finances, is the delivery of city services, and that's what would have to be cut.
You've said repeatedly over the last couple of months probably that the deadline is up, and you repeated yourself again last week that the time is up, and yet from this it seems as though you've bought another month to try and get the feds to commit something at this point, and the province as well. So is it indeed a fact where the time isn't up just yet and you're still waiting and hoping?
I think for anybody to conclude that the time isn't up would be a less than responsible conclusion, because, as I also have pointed out many times, the longer you leave the making of cuts, the deeper the cuts have to be, because you have less time in the year to make up for the shortfall of $1.35 billion. And so I don't want to create the impression for 1 second that there is the luxury of time. Yes, we have a city council coming up in July, and there will be a report then, another report from the city manager outlining the kinds of cuts that we would have to make. And yes, I've indicated those cuts would take hold in very serious manner in the fall. But the time is now, so that we don't have to sort of put the machinery and the works to, you don't just cut the transit system by half, which is the measure that we have talked about, and lay off thousands of people. There's a process that has to be followed, and I don't ever want to go down that road of following that process, but if we're forced to, that's exactly what we'll have to spend the latter part of the summer doing for implementation in the fall. So we do need to know now, and you know what? We started talking about this in April, and I understand the governments have been very busy helping other people, and we were quite prepared to be patient during that time. But cities and towns are vitally important to the well-being of this country and to the well-being of its economic recovery, and it is now time that that issue is addressed and addressed in a tangible way, and that we know exactly what we're dealing with, so that we can then finish up the job of doing whatever more we can do to save money and find efficiencies, but move forward and actually start looking after building the economy back up and creating jobs here in our city.
Okay, next up we have Christina from CP24. Go ahead.
Hi, Mayor. You've been very clear that this requires a national strategy, and you've also said today and previously that Premier Ford has been a good partner in advocating for the City of Toronto. Of course, the City of Toronto is the largest city in the country, so there's still no national strategy. You've been clear. You said this last week. Again, time's up. What makes you think at this point that one is coming? Are you preparing for, the idea here that maybe one's not coming, and the very likely reality, as you've noted, is that you will have to make these cuts? I guess what I'm wondering is, you've mentioned Premier Ford by name. I haven't heard you say, Prime Minister Trudeau has been a great partner in this, or any of the federal counterparts, and saying their names and sharing that they've been helpful through this.
I will say that the federal government have been very receptive to speaking with me. I spoke a couple of times to the Deputy Prime Minister over the course of the weekend. I've spoken to many other caucus members from Toronto. Toronto has 25 Liberal MPs, and they've been standing up in their national caucus to speak up for our city, as have other MPs from other cities been speaking up on behalf of cities, say, in the Toronto region. Here is the truth in a nutshell. there is going to be some help forthcoming. But because they've been having difficulty between themselves, the provinces and the federal government, sorting out exactly how that's going to come and who's going to pay for what, nothing has come. And the part that I think time is up on is that kind of back and forth dialogue. There are very serious matters at stake here that have to do with the recovery across this country. And I think it is just high time. At the end, you know, the buck stops at the very, very top. And the very, very top in this country is the Government of Canada. We only have one national government. And so I would say if the Government of Canada decided, fine then, if Ontario has been trying to be constructive, which they have been, let's do a deal with them. And if nobody else in the country wants to do a deal, fine. And I hope Premier Ford would say yes to that, because in the end, my concern is with the people of Toronto, although I care deeply about the other cities in the country and about the rest of the country. But my job is to represent the people of Toronto. And so if it's an Ontario-Canada deal that gets done and that paves the way for others to happen later, then that would satisfy me. But this notion that we can go on indefinitely, knowing that there is money that both governments have indicated is going to be devoted to municipalities, we need to know what it is, when it's coming, how it's going to come, and get to work on actually then maintaining the services that are important to the recovery of this country.
Okay, so Mayor, so you're noting here there's going to be help forthcoming. In your conversations with some of your federal counterparts, are you confident that that's enough to fulfill your budgetary needs, the remainder of it? And if not, can you be a bit more clear as to what the city would have to cut first? Is it TTC services? Is it daycare?
It's not up to me to be standing here today deciding in what order those cuts would be made. That's why we've presented a list of things. But the things that would have to be cut are obvious, only because they are the things on which we spend the people's money, providing transit service, supporting childcare, supporting homeless people, and so on. That's what we spend our money on, roads and parks, and those are the things. Frontline responders, this is what our budget is made up of. And so in the end, that's no secret. I will say that in the event some help is forthcoming and it isn't enough, I hope it will be to cover off, in our case, the $1.35 billion, then the city manager will obviously modify the report that he's going to submit in July, assuming we've heard some news by then, to take account of the fact that we've had some help. But I'm hopeful that they will step forward and, for all the cities in the country, provide enough money that it meets the needs that were set out very capably by the Federation of Canadian Municipalities in April. That seems like a long time ago, and guess what? It is. And so it's time that we got that sorted out, that they decide on a number. And I can't tell you. I can tell you numbers that I've heard. I can tell you there have been discussions going on back and forth as to who makes up how much of that number. And depending on the answers to those questions, you then know how much cities and towns are going to get. But I can't tell you a number right now because they haven't managed to sort that out among themselves.
Okay, next up we have Scott Lightfoot. Go ahead, Scott.
Good morning. Obviously, people are dealing with their own financial concerns. You've mentioned that reducing services isn't your first choice, neither is a tax increase. But what should Toronto taxpayers be prepared for at this point? Realistically, what should Toronto residents be expecting for the future?
Rather than me trying to speculate on what Toronto taxpayers should be ready for, I think I would urge them maybe to be in touch with their MPs, first and foremost, and their MPPs, their provincial members of parliament, to say, you know what, we're in no position to sustain service cuts right now because those are helping the city to get back on its feet, and we're also certainly in no position to sustain a massive tax increase of 60% or even some number approaching that. And so would you please finish up with your discussions and get on with helping these cities and towns right across this province and across this country. That's what we need taxpayers to do. I don't want to get into speculating on what will be required if we don't get that help, but I've indicated it will be a choice of only two things. One is service cuts and the other is tax increases, because we don't have any other options to turn to. Cities, and this is a subject for another day. I mean, we are one of the biggest governments in this country, bigger than, God bless the provinces that I've had the great privilege and joy of visiting, like Prince Edward Island and Nova Scotia. This city by itself is massively bigger than all those places, and yet we don't have the tools to deal with the huge challenges that face us in serving millions of people, 3 million people, 7 million in this region. It is an archaic constitutional framework that we operate within, but it is what it is. And so the things that people can expect from us are very simple, either service cuts or tax increases or both. And as I say, I'm very loath to see us impose tax increases on people who simply can't afford to pay them right now.
The report that's going to the Executive Committee mentions reviewing all city services. Are we talking about sort of bare bones how to keep the city operating, or is this an overall rethink of what priorities will be going forward. I'm looking at the TTC. You mentioned the hit that they've taken, but at their board meeting this morning, they're looking at a proposal to offer free Wi-Fi on surface routes. Are those kind of things not an option anymore? Is it just a matter of sort of how do we keep the buses and streetcars running at this point?
Well, certainly the challenge that's in front of us first and foremost is keeping the buses and streetcars and subways running, and that's a big challenge in an environment where you're losing hundreds of millions of dollars in revenue. But at the same time, if you look at it this way, some of these things you would say are increases in spending or new investments, such as Wi-Fi on transit vehicles, in fact, might well represent, and I would see it this way, as an investment in the future of the economy. If we can have people productively occupied when they're sitting on a bus going to work, doing some work, communicating back and forth with some of their confreres and so on, I think that's a plus. And it's something that is just a required feature of a productive global city of the 21st century, which Toronto is. So it's the trade-off you have to, go through every single time you look at a cut or an investment. Is this something that in the long term is going to be beneficial to the growth of the city and to its reputation and to its economy, or is it something you can dispense with? And that is the exercise that those kinds of reviews go through. And yes, you do look at things perhaps you shouldn't be doing anymore. You do look at different ways to do things. I am very impressed at the degree to which our city staff have found ways to digitize many city services. I've mentioned some of them in previous briefings over the course of the pandemic. And I will be reminding them as we approach the post-pandemic period of how fast things moved during the pandemic to digitize services and make improvements to the way we deliver things for people, because that's evidence that when you need to be at wartime speed, you do it. And I would suggest wartime speed should be the order of the day, because that also saves us money. Digital services, for example, save money for the city, as well as being more convenient for the residents.
Okay, next up we have Camille from Radio Canada. Go ahead.
Oui, bonjour. Une question en français, M. Tory. À propos des fusillades et de la violence armée à Toronto, est-ce que vous pensez que la pandémie a eu un impact parce qu'on a vu la fermeture, par exemple, de programmes pour les jeunes? Et si vous êtes obligé de faire d'autres coupures, est-ce que ça aurait un impact sur des programmes sociaux contre la violence?
Peut-être la pandémie, mais je pense que la météo a un grand impact au sujet de la violence. Nous n'avons pas de réponse magique au sujet de la violence. Une réponse magique n'existe pas. Mais nous devons soutenir la police pendant les réformes maintenant, et aussi faire des investissements dans les communautés et avec les familles, et aussi changement des lois au sujet du cautionnement, etc. C'est la solution toujours quand je parle au cet sujet, je parle au sujet des trois mesures, le support pour la police, les changements des lois et aussi les investissements aux familles et aux quartiers. C'est la meilleure solution maintenant, et les investissements dans les familles et dans les quartiers, c'est très important. Et cette année, dans les circonstances au sujet que je pense ce matin, nous allons qu'est-ce que c'est le mot pour spend? Nous allons dépenser. Merci. Nous allons dépenser beaucoup des autres millions de dollars au sujet des investissements dans les familles et dans les quartiers.
Oui. Et juste une question sur un autre sujet. L'aéroport Pearson de Toronto a annoncé aujourd'hui des coupures de 500 postes. Est-ce que c'est ce genre de coupure que vous craignez, par exemple, pour le TTC ou d'autres agences?
Le problème à l'aéroport est le même problème pour le TTC et pour les autres entreprises et pour beaucoup des gouvernements. C'est un problème si nous n'avons pas les passagers à l'aéroport Pearson, nous n'avons besoin beaucoup des emplois. Et c'est un problème pour nous, et nous espérons que le voyager va retourner ici soon. Sorry about that.
Okay, next up we have Matt Bingley from Global. Go ahead, Matt.
Hi, Mayor, I just have actually one question, and I apologize if you've already detailed it. The $514 million in cost savings identified, can you, and the underspending, can you say where those cuts are actually coming from, or where that money has been found?
So let me just flip to where I talked about. On the staff side, there have been 9,980 people affected by decisions that have been taken that have involved some of that savings of $514 million, and that includes 1,008 full-time staff who are on unpaid leave, 475 part-time staff on unpaid leave, 5,100 spring recreation workers who weren't hired, and many of them have been hired year after year after year to run our spring programs, which were canceled, and another close to 3,500 rec workers who were not hired because of programming reductions. So that's sort of on the people side. And then we have things like the alterations that have been made to TTC service to match the demand. And as you'll recall, at the last commission meeting, I think about a month or so ago, a new service plan was approved that made some alterations. In fact, there were some service increases brought about on areas where the buses were very crowded as people continued to go to work on the bus, but other areas where there were very modest changes, but those modest changes can save quite a bit of money. And as well, there, of course, is the savings that come from fuel and wages from the fact that the service is a little less robust. Presto commissions, for example, are not paid on people who are not paying fares and not traveling on the TTC, so they are reduced. Crossing guards have not been needed during the entire spring period because kids were not in school. We have made a number of changes to offer services digitally during the course of the pandemic, and this saves money because people can do the work online any time of the day or night without city employees having to be involved. And we've had a great number of energy and supply consumption savings, for example, fleet costs and building costs for ourselves, simply because the city government has been largely shut down, people working from home. So those are just examples, and you will see in the city manager's report to come in July, we get into much more granular things that have to happen, some of them affecting the employees who work with us in the city. I mean, you know, when your budget is made up as much as ours is, and that's true of many companies and so on as well, of people and their wages and benefits, well then when it comes time to constrain, you have to have an impact on people and their wages and benefits. And what Councillor Crawford and myself and the city manager and the CFO have been working on is trying to find every single way that we can, including the stuff we've already done, that doesn't have a negative impact on the citizens, so that we can, you know, improve the way in which the government is managing its finances during a financial crisis without having a direct impact on people to the maximum extent possible. And that's what the city manager's report will do too, but it gets tougher and tougher the further you get into this.
So is it, other than the staffing changes, is it fair to say that some of those savings would have traditionally gone into the reserve fund or something like that? No, because you see a lot of the savings I talked about on fuel, on building costs, on you know, Presto commissions. I mean, had the TTC been operating as normal and the ridership was 1.8 million a day instead of 500,000, we would have had to pay those commissions, but we also would have had the revenue that goes with them. So none of these things are ordinary course at all. These are extraordinary measures that had to be taken to either cut back or to realize savings that came about because things are far from normal. And so I would just say that I think without cutting into services, which we have, you know, really urged the public servants not to do, and in fact they've had enhanced services for groups like the homeless and other vulnerable Torontonians, I think they've done a magnificent job of finding already $500 million, but it gets tougher now. We get into the stuff now where it has a dramatic effect on TTC service or on childcare or on homelessness or the things we spend our money on. There's no way around it.
Okay, and last we have Francine from the Star. Go ahead, Francine.
Good morning, Mayor Tory. My question is this: at what point do you have to start making the cuts?
Well, you know, the answer would normally be when you're running a big organization, and I've had, you know, quite a bit of experience at this, obviously, is the sooner the better, because you don't have to make cuts that are as deep if you make them earlier. But we haven't had that luxury because we kept getting told, as we have been, that there is some help on the way from the other governments. And so if my frustration seems to be showing through a bit this morning with respect to the fact that that help hasn't come yet when the other governments have repeatedly told us, both of them, that it will be coming, it is because the longer it goes, the more we would have to cut if it didn't come. And so that's why I'm saying if they simply told us now, yes, you're going to get this much money and here's when it's going to come, we would know what cuts we did or did not have to make. And so the answer to your question is that the likely start of those things would be in the late summer because the report is going to go to the City Council for consideration by them in late July. And we will take it from there, obviously with the guidance of City Council under the leadership of the Budget Chief and the Chief Financial Officer and the City Manager and myself.
Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you all very much. Merci beaucoup. Apologize for my French. It is what it is.